A year ago, I built a Proa on the deck of my catamaran. I built it in 1 week, but then I needed a year to get it sailing really good. In that time, there were some thrills and spills, and I slowly built up to sailing it in really quite rough conditions, as well as pushing it up to the highest speeds possible. When I was sailing this hard, a lot of water came on and I don't want to stop to bail, so I decided I would give Waimea a self-draining cockpit for his birthday. And a paint job too. One of the things that makes this Proa good is that it's quite light, so I didn't want to lose that while building the deck. So I thought I would build the deck out of 4mm plywood. Of course, 4mm plywood is extremely flexible, and it's so thin you can actually just cut it with a skill knife, like you would on a balsa wood model aircraft. But if I had lots of struts underneath, it should be plenty stiff, and I could make the struts from 4mm plywood as well, but have it on its end. I cut out a test piece to get a feel for how stiff that would be. Here I am putting my weight down on it. It was only 4cm wide and it felt good. So then I cut out lots of struts. It requires lots of passes with the knife, but I found that it leaves a really smooth surface, much nicer than you would get with a saw. At first I would cut a bit and then break it off, but it works much better just to keep on going until you've got it all the way through. And I think it probably comes out more accurate than a saw, at least when you're doing straight cuts. I also made 2 full bulkheads so that if water does get inside it won't slosh around too much and upset the trim. I marked the height of the floor on the bulkheads and then set up a horizontal string line as a reference to fit the struts to. I marked where the struts would go, and then came the most fiddly part, which would be trimming the struts. First I measured and cut them to the correct length, and then I used the sliding bevel to find the angles in the side. And don't assume that the angle on one side and the other is the same. That took the rest of the day, but eventually I had a boatload of struts. The struts are only 4mm plywood. I want it to be light, and I feel like that's going to be enough. And depth is more strength than if it was thick. And I've got 2 full bulkheads, so if water does get in, it will stay in one spot. The next task was templating the deck. The struts all fit perfectly, so I just used them to make the template by taping them to a stick and then laying that on the piece of plywood that was destined to become the deck. I marked and then carefully cut that out. That's pretty good, except for this section. But I also just realised if I cut it here and do the back from a second piece, I'll be able to get it like this under these. Bending the side back won't work once I've got the struts attached. I sealed the inside of the boat with epoxy when I built it, but this would be my last chance to access the interior, so I decided to put another coat on just to be sure. I've borrowed this battery-powered sander and vacuum from the Auckland Library of Tools. Not only is it cheaper to join than to buy tools that I don't need very often, but it saves a lot of clutter on storing those tools, and it also means you can try out tools that you would consider owning. And on that note, I decided that a battery-powered sander and vacuum doesn't have a long enough runtime to really be useful for a boat building size job. I also hand sanded the edges of all the struts and bulkheads. I put just a little bit of microfiber thickened epoxy on the end of each strut and positioned them carefully. The central strut has a horizontal piece on the top that's to support the deck joint. Just using a little bit of glue right now to hold them all in place. I will add a proper fillet before I put the deck on. With the struts glued in, the hull was becoming stiffer and it was necessary to trim the decks to get them in again. Now I could seal the inside of the hull, all the struts and bulkheads, and the bottom side of the deck. I put on 1 coat and let it go sticky and then put a second coat on. This is going to become completely inaccessible, so I won't have another chance to do this. While the seal coat was still sticky, I added fillets to the bulkheads and struts. I did this after the seal coat so that I did not disturb the fillets by applying the seal coat. Otherwise I would have needed to let the fillets harden and then do the seal coat, which would have meant waiting until tomorrow. Time for a coffee break and to let that epoxy go off a little. I applied thickened epoxy to the top of all the struts and bulkheads and installed the 2 deck pieces and held them down with anything I had that was heavy. Okay, weighted down with a few heavy things. Okay, that's over the hump. This job is easy now. I won't actually be able to lie down like that because you're in the way. This is only 4mm plywood, but it still feels solid. Struts 20 centimeters apart was just a guess. I felt that would be enough, and it is. This is how I prepare the epoxy for a fillet. Notice I do 1 pump of each. It makes it much easier to not lose count. Mix that epoxy, and then I don't measure the thickener. Here we're using microfibers. I just kind of add stuff and mix it until I get the consistency I want, which is thick enough to sort of stand up. I'm using a plastic spatula. You want the cheapest kind of plastic. You can't even buy this at the shop. You've got to go to like a second-hand shop. The really cheap plastic, the epoxy doesn't stick to it, so you can just like break it off after it's set. The new ones seem to be silicone, which epoxy sticks quite well to, and a spatula is good for getting all the last bits of epoxy out of the container. We're going to put all this epoxy into a freezer bag. Freezer bags are extremely cheap, like a couple of dollars for 100, and they're strong enough to squeeze epoxy out of. The trick to getting the epoxy into them is to open the bag and put it inside of a cup or something. Here I'm using the cardboard from an old roll of tape. Now you can pick that up and snip off the corner, creating a piping bag. Then we just squeeze it out into the corner. This method comes out very tidy and you don't get epoxy everywhere. Of course, I'm still wearing gloves anyway. I've been told that it's better to push the bead of epoxy along rather than pull it. It goes down into the corner better. The same applies for silicone from a caulking gun or something. Then we make a special spatula to smooth that out. Just a flat stick with a rounded end. Works best with a bevel carved onto it. I just make that with my angle grinder. Epoxy is going to build up on the stick. Put that back in the container. You've got a round fillet now, but some of the epoxy will have gone out onto the sides of the boat. You can scoop that up with another tool made from a piece of scrap wood. This one is just shaped like a chisel, and you just sort of go along like this very carefully. So this method is a lot easier than doing a bad fillet and then sanding it. Oh, and one last thing. I'm wearing a hat inside the tent. That's just to keep the hair out of my face, so I don't feel tempted to push my hair out of the way with my hands, which may have epoxy on it, so I don't get epoxy on my hair. If you have short hair, that's probably not necessary. And then I fiberglass the deck. Of course, a lot of bits of random gear and stuff like that is going to be just chucked in there, so I want it to be as durable as possible. So adding a deck over the entire Proa changes it from an open C shape, which does not have a lot of torsional stiffness, to a closed box beam, which is massively more stiff. And now there's also a couple 100 litres of sealed buoyancy compartment, so if I capsize and ride it, very little water will be inside. The Proa is now structurally expedition ready, but its birthday isn't over because it's going to get painted too. This Proa is designed to store compactly on the back of my boat, and that means the armour needs to fit inside. It didn't quite fit as well as it did before, but I trimmed the legs a little bit, and then it was good enough. To do a good paint job, you need to do a lot of sanding, and the deck of a boat isn't a good place to do that. So I paddled around to a boat ramp, disassembled the Proa, attached some improvised wheels, loaded everything on board, and walked 5 kilometers to my workshop. Subscribers will have seen the workshop in other videos. This is a shared workshop called Hackland that I pay $20 a week to be a member of. I walked my Proa past designer furniture stores and luxury car yards. I'm sure I got a few funny looks, but to be honest, I think I've just learned to block all that out. We walked 5 kilometers in less than 2 hours. I didn't go very fast because it's faster to be careful than it is to have to fix things that you broke. And soon enough we arrived at the workshop. If you want to do a good paint job, it's actually about the sanding. I brought my own sander to the shed workshop because a sander is actually quite fragile and needs to be used correctly. Any sander that was left in a shed workshop is definitely going to get abused and won't be very good for long. And a sander is noisy and unpleasant, and the job is quite tedious. Usually when you use power tools, the job is over quite quickly, but sanding still takes way longer than you want. Starting with a coarse grit and then moving to progressively finer grits does help a lot though. I used the mesh style sandpaper for this, which seemed to work pretty well, but what gave out on it was the fuzz on the back that sticks onto the Velcro thing. That's the part I'm quite suspicious of. It seems to not last very long at all. The mesh style sandpaper says on the pack that it lasts 4 times longer, but it's not really that long and then it just flies off the sander. If anyone knows what I'm doing wrong, please post a comment. One thing I'd wanted to do since building the boat was stick on Quila rails to the top edge of the gunnel. Quila is about the best wood that you can buy at an ordinary hardware store in New Zealand. It's used for decking, and I think of it as poor man's teak. Like teak, it's durable enough to not need painting, and what I've found is that anything that's on a corner gets a lot more wear and abrasion on it, and the paint is going to rub off. If I can stick some wood that doesn't need painting in the high wear areas, then it will stay looking good. The downside is that it's quite heavy, but I'm going to plane it into thin strips to minimize that problem. I glued a strip onto the side of each gunnel and another strip onto the top of the gunnel. This also covers the last bit of plywood end grain, so the boat should last pretty well. After a year of sailing this boat, there had been some repairs I needed to make, so I applied some filler and made sure everything was smooth. I painted epoxy with graphite in it onto the bottom of the armour. A few months ago I had done this on the waka. This seems to stay runny no matter how much you mixed in, so I masked off the entire topsides with the painter's drop cloth. And then finally, I drilled some cockpit drains on the leeward side of the main hull. I did this on the leeward side so that if there was any water left when I was on the beach, I could just lift up the armour and tip it out. Finally, it was time to actually start painting. I'm using 2-pot polyurethane, which is a 7:1 ratio. I measured the paint with the mixing cup and then the hardener with the syringe. This paint is expensive, so I prefer to carefully measure how much I will need and mix multiple batches. I also had the great idea to clean the mixing cup immediately after using it, which made measuring the next batch much easier. I'm applying the paint with a roller and then smoothing it out with a brush. When I painted the catamaran, I used a high quality foam roller, but unfortunately I left buying the rollers until the morning of the painting day, and the hardware store didn't have the ones I wanted. The cheaper roller that they did have made a lot of bubbles, but quick thinking and a brush sorted that out and it turned out pretty nicely. I'm very happy with how the colour has turned out. Reminds me of I was thinking yesterday, it reminds me of a small boy's Christmas present. And then I started to remember actually something bright red, like a rocking horse, and maybe seeing it set up and being painted in the shed. So maybe it was like a gift from my little brother. I have so far been unable to corroborate that memory, but in any case, it was time to go back in the water. That means another walk, but this time looking brand new. One thing that wasn't brand new though was my trailer. Okay, I'm having a problem here, the wheel rubbing. It's a lot worse than that happened last time on the other side, but this one is worse. So I'm going to unload everything and see if I can fix it. It's not going to be tighter. The wheels come from a kid's bike, and the rear wheel contains some sort of ratchet, and it only goes one way, and it's something inside is corroding a bit. I need a new wheel on this side. It's fucked. Shunted it, going the other way. That one's still fine. It's not as bad as it was before, but it's still doing it. It's actually in there. That needs to be replaced, but can make it to the water. Still a couple of k's to go. still have mostly the same lashing system as I did when I first launched the boat, although I have added locating blocks so that the cross beams and armour end up in the same spot. With the lee board I need to lash on the armour much more rigidly, but I can just use bicycle tube right here because I'm only going to paddle it around the corner. Here's an experimental mode of assembled wheeling. Needs a few bugs worked out. But we were floating again. It was so satisfying to paddle away. Now that my boat had a self-draining cockpit, it was expedition ready. Thanks for watching the whole video. Please post a comment and hit subscribe to see that expedition.